Okay, we'll get started here. Thank you all for coming. I know there's a little crowd. I wish I could sort of be out there, but it's being recorded, so I have to stand up here. We're going to start with a little bit of an exercise, if that's okay with everyone. I think the first thing that I would like you all to do is to think about something that is incredibly private. Think about something you've done, something you've seen, you cheated on something, whatever the case may be. Think about that one private thing, okay? Thank you for closing. Thank you very much. The water feature was overwhelming my voice. Thanks. And if you can think about it and you have it in your head, whatever it might be, and then I would like you to write it down on the sheet of paper in front of you. Oh, anything private. The most private thing that you can think of. And then what I'd like you to do is to hand that most private thing to the person next to you. And of course, this is ridiculous, right? We're not going to write down the most private thing we have and then give it to some random person, although it's done right there and it can create laughter, of course. But
they're allowed.
The idea is, and actually maybe that's a good example, right? You said they're in love, is that what you said?
They're allowed.
Oh, they're allowed, yeah. Or maybe they're married. But the thing is, so this idea of sort of even keeping, we keep even things from our family, the people we love, our wife, our husband, whatever the case may be. The idea is sort of at a higher level to sort of think about privacy, what it really means, and how we can really sort of retain privacy in all the things that we do. And I will sort of, by way of introduction, my name is Oberman. I started a company called Spider Oak several years ago. The real driving focus behind the company was to really think about how we are interacting today, and the things we put down on paper, which we're doing less and less, and in the computer, how do we ensure, how do we think about, how do we capture this idea of privacy? What does that really mean? I will give a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not a developer. I've been in and around software pretty much my whole life. My father started a software company in the early 80s, but I do not know the first. I can bold something and maybe italicize it, and that is about it. So this is more of a high-level conversation about how we think about and how we sort of interact with privacy, as opposed to the bits and bytes of it, although I do understand enough of it to maybe answer some surface questions. Okay. And I was actually told that it's actually critical in these presentations to put a photo of something. And this happens to be the photo of the person who actually does know what he's doing. And this is my business partner, Alan. And he is really, I guess you could call him a privacy nut. I mean, which is funny because I don't certainly call myself that. But he has sort of always thought about, been thinking about, been trying to understand how we can really think of, operating in a world today while still retaining a level of privacy. And we'll get into talking about what those various levels of privacy are, how should they exist, where should they exist, and sort of move forward from there. Okay. And again, from a philosophical standpoint, we start thinking about privacy and security, which we're going to talk about in a second, and transparency, and all these things that sort of evolve around this topic. I put up a couple examples here. I will not name companies specifically per se, although I may call a few of them out later. There was a company a while ago that had their 100 millionth image uploaded into their system, and the person who is the co-founder of the company decided to blog about it. All excited, 100 millionth photo, really 100th document photo, whatever it was. Really, it was actually a photo in this case. Really, really exciting. And the user base sort of was like, wait a second. How in the world, A, did they know that it was a photo, and B, that they knew what the photo was of? Like, what's going on here? And it's one of those things you sort of take for granted, this concept that these things are sort of inherently done in a way where your privacy is retained. And this is an extremely well-known company, a company I happen to have very close ties to, and very successful. But it is interesting how we think about and how we interact with this question. and from an economic model standpoint, and here, I will go back to what I previously said. You think about companies like Google and Facebook, how they are thinking about privacy, and from their perspective, it really is more of an issue from the way I think about it in terms of transparency. Obviously, Facebook was designed to share things. By definition, if you share things, they are no longer private. However, who are they private then to? And that is, that then raises that whole debate. There's been a lot in the press lately about employers demanding that people give up their Facebook passwords during the interview process. I mean, it is unbelievable. So now, you have all this non-private information that is out for all of your friends, family, and potentially others. And now your employers or your potential employers are even asking for it. So now you're exposing everything. And you can start thinking about where those lines get drawn. I think I can speak for most of us in this room. A younger generation has extremely different boundaries in terms of where they think about those lines as opposed to where we think about those lines. And that is sort of forever changing. It'll be interesting to see, if those things sort of backlash backward. Google is another good example. I mean, the FTC just fined them $22.5 million, which sounds like a lot maybe to us. It's not a very, it's 4 hours worth of work for Google. But, the idea is that they were engaging in putting things in different places where they told the users that they weren't. And then they were going around and selling that information to whomever wanted to buy it. And, these are things that transparency around this idea of privacy becomes a critical issue. Again, not to name names, but there was a company, in our space that had a little password problem. And, for a while they had an issue where people could access accounts without really entering the proper password. So, there are things that we can do from an error perspective. How do we think about privacy and how do we sort of encapsulate it so that it's, it's not even prone to these types of errors. And of course, you have user lists that are stolen, and there are a billion examples of those. And I won't go into those specific details, but this idea of sort of those things getting stolen, how are they, how are they protected? How are they insured? And again, where does privacy fit into these overarching ideas and concepts? So, in our industry in particular, one of the things that we talk a lot about is understanding the distinction between privacy and security. They are very, very much not the same things. In fact, my business partner, whose photo you saw, he always likes to claim, those who can't sell privacy sell security. It is a very different, they're actually not the same at all. A good example would be security, and let's use banks. Security is this idea of saying, look, I have money in the bank. The bank knows I have money in the bank, but they're not going to let anybody else get to that money. And then let's move to the Swiss bank example. Now I have a box. I put something inside that box, and not even the people who operate the bank know what's inside that box. Okay? So then now you have the difference between security and privacy. And they are very, very different. I wanted to put up the definitions here because even if, from reading the definitions, you get a clear sense of really how different they are. And when you're, oftentimes in this industry, they're really confused, but they shouldn't be. The right choice. How do we think about where to draw these lines between privacy and security? Now, there are obviously, even in our own company, you have billing information. Billing information, in some ways, needs to be plain text to the people at the company. We need to, we need to interact with these people. We need to bill them on a credit card every so often, if that's the case. There's contact information that relates to these people. But, in thinking about again, in thinking about things from the standpoint of privacy, how much information do we actually need? Do we need to know what hometown they're from? Do we need to know what their favorite color is? Do we need to know that on Tuesdays they prefer a Big Mac as opposed to a sub? You start thinking about all this information that we're collecting on these various people, and you start thinking about, where is the value? Is it valuable? And then, if it's valuable, how are we going to be able to distinguish that and draw these lines between privacy and security so that we have people that work in our company, these people have access to this type of data. I mean, what could they potentially do with that data if it gets outside of our walls? And is there things that they should never have access to? Are there things that the company as a whole, again, back to this bank account, should never be able to access and view? It's really, I think it is critically important as a company to think about all of these different things in terms of understanding the boundaries and what are the right choice for your company, for your approach, what you're trying to sell, what you're trying to accomplish. And again, the business case, and I know you're not really supposed to talk too much about myself or my experiences with my particular business, but in our case, we started in 2005. It was an interesting landscape. There were a lot of companies that were in the online backup space, and I probably should say, SpiderOak is an online backup security sharing company. I'm sorry, I should have sort of said that in the beginning. So a lot of companies in the backup space, and there were a lot of, and it was pretty crowded. You had Mozy, Carbonite were the real, two big guys in this space, and we started thinking about not necessarily sort of their model, but really kind of thinking about how could we differentiate ourselves? What could be something that we could do that could be different than the way they were doing it? And we thought about this in a couple different ways. And other than just from a product orientation standpoint in terms of how our product is set up, we really thought about it from a privacy standpoint. And at the time, privacy was a non-issue. People didn't care. They were so enamored with all things going on in the cloud. Believe me, and the truth is, if I knew half of what my business partner had to go through to build our product so that it could be private, I would have killed him and said, don't do it, because it wasn't worth it back then. Now, fast forward 6 years, and all of a sudden, privacy is a critical issue in all of this. And frankly, we're moving, as a company, we're actually moving a little bit more away from the consumer space and a little bit more in the enterprise space, where it's even more important to care about privacy and things like that. But at a higher level, this idea of sort of thinking about, what really is the business case, and not necessarily thinking about how these trends are happening today, but how things are going to move forward. And as sort of side anecdote, there was a shoe company in New York City that was transmitting credit card transactions over an open wireless internet connection. And a van parked outside and started ripping these credit card numbers off the open internet connection. And sure enough, millions and millions and millions of dollars later, lawsuits ensued, so on and so forth. And those are the kind of things that, again, if you were to, drive your car around the block, 7, 10, 8 years ago, you could just find open wireless here. They were just everywhere. No one at home thought, all right, well, this is something I need to encrypt. Well, now, or I need to, have a password for it. And now, of course, everybody does it. And, there are other things. Privacy, we think is a hot topic now. There will be other things moving forward where people don't necessarily think about how these things are going to impact in the long term. I think sometimes we ignore these things, and privacy, I feel like, is one of those things that kind of got ignored for a while because we were so enamored with what was going on. And oddly, and I can sort of say this, I feel like all the younger generation people are going to sense a backlash because they are now, this Facebook crowd is now moving out of college and moving into the business world, and they're having to expose a part of their life that maybe they didn't think they were going to have to before. That brings up some interesting scenarios. But really understanding the business case for privacy, and that it is a critical part, in my opinion, of any business. And then you start thinking about laying the foundation. How do we think about implementing privacy and security, for that matter? For us, and again, going back to my business partner and him doing all this stuff sort of with or without my knowledge, privacy is not something you can do in the aftermath. It's not something you can say, 3 years into product development, you know what, I'm going to go back and now I care about privacy and now I'm going to implement it into the product. You really have to start from the beginning and from scratch. And I know that may be complicated if you are already far down the development timeline, but it is something that definitely needs to be implemented from a very early point, because and because there are going to be, over the life cycle of a company, a lot of different times where you're going to have to think back to the decisions you made and why you made them and the importance behind them. And if you build privacy at the foundation, it becomes a lot easier to deal with those down the road. So I am a big fan of building privacy into the very fabric of the company, and so that it could be a part of really everything that goes on. Using the community. I think this is another big topic, and like most things, it took me a little while to figure this part out. But there is a really active and wonderful community out there around around this issue of privacy, and around this idea of understanding privacy, understanding user rights, understanding how we can think about privacy in this emerging world. And I will use one because I like them, and we've done a lot of work with them. The EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, is fantastic in this space. They care, they get it, and they are doing a lot of work and a lot of fighting on behalf of us without us even knowing it. All of us that walk around on this planet, frankly, that are using the internet, they are, and certainly in this country, they are certainly doing a lot of good work for us. So, but there are a lot of great outlets to go to, and I think it, and even just, I think from a developer perspective, I will sort of say, as a non-developer, developers definitely are among the most moral and ethical people I've ever met in my life. Now, I guess maybe I shouldn't make that bold statement, but I graduated with a sociology degree, so we make sweeping analogies all the time. And so, use the local communities. I think that's understanding that there is a community out there, and that you can use the community to do things and to understand how they're using privacy and how they're thinking about these topics is critical. And the last is staying committed. Really sort of, at various points, and I will say it is a lot harder when you're building a product to ensure that privacy exists at every level of that product's development cycle. This is, we're not that far into this, and the truth is I'm almost at the end of my deck here. So, but it is a lot harder to go back and think about. I have, when in our case in particular, our servers never know plain text data under any circumstance ever. So, for example, the government comes to us and says, "Hey, Ethan Oberman is into some bad stuff. We've got to get his data." And it's happened a couple times. We can give them the data, which we would have to by law if they go through the proper channels. But at the end of the day, it's encrypted data blocks, and it doesn't mean anything. And so we'd hand it over, and they'd say, "Well, give us the key." We don't have the key. Well, where's the key? The key belongs to the user. They're the only one that has it. We never see it. It is never transmitted to us in plain text. And now, let me give you the other side of that. It has been infinitely harder to be a company that is in the online synchronization and sharing space where the server doesn't know the data, right? There are a lot of these companies, and there's a couple big ones, you guys know, who their job is actually infinitely easier than ours, because they're comparing plain text data on their servers, and they're able to make deductions. And they're able to make deductions even between multiple users. So now you can do things like collaboration, which become very, very easy, and sharing, which become very, very easy. But in our world, we kind of traded the easy for the privacy, and it was a decision we made, and it's one that we butted up against several times. And it's hard. It's hard to really stay committed to that, especially when you're seeing a lot of other companies gain a lot of other traction doing things another way. Which is, not to take anything away from their model, I think it's great. And the truth is, I think there are many implementations where privacy and sort of a non-private world, maybe a secure world that's not private, can really live side by side in harmony. Because the truth is, you do want to do a lot of these things. The cloud is built for interaction. It's built for collaboration. But I still believe, and I think that a lot of us still believe, it still has privacy still has a place. that thing you wrote down on that piece of paper, you still should be able to put it into your computer. It still should be able to go up in the cloud, and it still should not be able to be read by anybody, period, under any circumstance. And, you know, look, I am not a privacy nut. I don't read privacy blogs. I don't hang out on encryption sites and think about, you know, how things get more encrypted or less encrypted. But I do believe that there are thoughts in our head that get put down. There are thoughts, there are images in our head that get, photos get taken. There are things that happen that we interact with our computers, and it's more and more now, that, you know, I believe that those things still should live in a private context. And, you know, I think building privacy from the ground up, you know, I think really speaks to that. And I think, you know, we're going to see a little bit of a backlash, and companies start thinking a lot more about this as we move forward. And, you know, I think there are, you know, I mentioned the Google thing, and I know Facebook has had ongoing issues with this. You know, so that's really it. I know, you know, we're kind of a half hour in, and you know, I know it's sort of a tighter group. But do you guys have any questions, any thoughts, any ideas? Yes.
Yeah, I was starting to get interested when I saw that you did synchronization, so I wanted to explore that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That I have a server located in Dallas, and my office is in Palo Alto, and so I want to synchronize between Dallas and Palo Alto, and I'm using SugarSync. You may have heard of.
I know them.
Yeah, right. It's
a good company. Yeah.
As an intermediary, and basically, what I want is the data in Dallas to show up on my computer, and the fact that SugarSync has a copy is merely a artifact.
You want to do a point-to-point. You want a point-to-point.
Yeah, that's what I want. Now, it would be more secure if you know, it would be more private if we pulled SugarSync out, dropped SpiderOak in, but that's still, you know, but that's still suboptimal.
Yeah, no, well, and doing things point to point, you know, when we have, you know, we actually launched LandSync not so long ago, which, you know, does that, but obviously both the machines have to be within the same network in order for that to work, where they're actually just, you know, and it still goes up to the cloud even still. And, you know, I'm certainly, don't mean to say that, you know, SpiderOak is really engineered or designed to solve every problem, and that is a common problem, and we hear a lot about that. Yeah, I mean, and in your scenario, especially if it's not something you terribly, you know, care about the privacy of, and if SugarSync is actually working well, there are point-to-point sync companies that I think will, the software that will do that for you.
Yeah, but it's more to the point that what I really want is real-time sync.
And they don't do that for you?
No, they do.
Yeah.
But it'd be nice if it were private.
If it were, sorry?
It would be nice if it were private, but
yeah, I mean, and that is really, I mean, that is what we do. And, you know, again, this is one of those things that it doesn't, you know, privacy doesn't necessarily matter to everybody in the same way, and it certainly doesn't matter for all data. I mean, you know, you think about things like music. I mean, do people really care if someone's music collection gets exposed? I suppose only if you have a lot of, you know, Billy Idol. That was a joke. Whatever. Or, you know, I don't know, who does my listen to, whatever. But, you know, or, you know, there are things that we don't care that are necessarily public. But there are things like tax returns. There are things like, you know, love letters. I mean, there are things that we do care about, that we do want to retain privacy. And, you know, in a business context, those things actually increase. There are business planning documents. There are, you know, there's a lot of, and, you know, and I mean, that is sort of, you know, I think ultimately, I think a lot of these companies are going to have to adopt much more, you know, higher standards to their privacy mechanisms. Because privacy also means that people at that company cannot look at your data, even if they wanted to. even if I wanted to see what data you had synchronizing between two endpoints, I couldn't do it. I mean, I literally do not have the keys. I can't even tell what file types they are.
What happens if you lose your key?
It's a good question. And I can't swear because it's being recorded. But you know, there's a 4-letter word and you're pretty much it. That's done. You're done. Because there's no way to recover that key. In a consumer world, you know, but that's the thing. It's the only way to ensure privacy, and that's it. And a lot of companies aren't even willing to go to that level. I will say, and you know, thank you for bringing that up. I thought this was going to be the end of our company before we even started, because we were talking about how we were going to handle the password. And if people forgot their password, they're done. And I was like, well, you know, we got no business, because people are going to forget their password left, right, and center, and it's never going to work. I'm happy to report, some 6 years later, that it is a non-issue. It does happen from time to time, and we do have a password hint field that's open text, and you know, I mean, people do crazy things. We had a guy that wrote a paragraph, and he used a decipher that only he knew. I mean, he wrote in and told us about this. I mean, people do, but that was, you know, we do have a password hint that we can return, and if it's what was your dog's, you know, you can write in what was my dog's first name, and maybe that information is readily available. So the idea is to make it as secure, as private as you want it. But yes, thankfully that has not been an issue. I was really scared about that. And moving into enterprise space, we've actually done some interesting things to ensure that privacy, basically those keys are managed by the enterprise. And Spider Oak still actually remains zero knowledge. We ship them a VM, they load it behind their firewall, it actually connects to their LDAP Active Directory and does it all without us actually seeing any of that. So we can kind of keep hands off, which is, you know, ultimately our goal in all of these interactions. Yes?
How do you protect the actual transmission of the password? Presumably the password's got to get up to you and there's a point of vulnerability.
And we're now slowly, I will sort of tiptoe around this because I don't want to give you wrong information. So we use, when we first launched, we had, sign up had to happen in the client. Right, you download the product, and then you put in your username and password and all that stuff, so it can happen inside the client. The client will retain those keys. The client does all the encryption, uploads the data, downloads the data, and if you add different devices, the first thing you do when you add that device is you enter your username and password to verify, but those keys were never transmitted to Spider Oak because you're doing it inside the application, never on the web. You know, fast forward a couple years, one of the really exciting things, frankly, in our industry, and this is one of the things that I think is going to push privacy forward, is the web is getting much better at handling things like encryption. And that is exciting for us because it allows us to do a lot of other things. So now, now we have a web sign-up tool, which we didn't have before, because things like bcrypt came into existence that allow us to do encryption on the web without us actually knowing the password. So that password is never transmitted to us in a plain text context. Now, I will sort of say as a caveat, and maybe I shouldn't do this, but I will do it anyway. There are a couple times where that password is actually transmitted to our servers. It's actually 2 cases in particular. And we note it on our website because, again, going back to transparency, we feel like it is a critical thing to talk about this. If someone accesses their data on a public computer, goes to spideroak.com and enters their username and password, obviously for the length of that session, we know the password because we needed to decrypt the data to give it all back to you. Now, if you're traveling through Europe, you don't have your computer, you have a document that you absolutely need, maybe you don't, and it's not written to disk, and it's destroyed the moment that session's over. So we try to do as much as we can within that time period to keep the security intact, because at that point, privacy is now broken. Now you're just talking about security. And the other is when now you're accessing things on mobile devices. We are working quickly on actually solving that problem. As these devices get more powerful, it becomes easier and easier to do that. And I was, going to talk last session about Windows 8, which is exciting because now you have, basically the same operating system on all different devices, which will allow us to basically ship one client, which will work on all these different devices. So the same encryption that works on a desktop will to work on a mobile device, which is great. But those are the two instances in which those things are broken. But so it's a good question. But from if you set up SpiderOak and we advise only running it off of desktop, off the desktop app, then that password is never transmitted to us, which was a very hard thing to. I mean, that goes back to the foundational conversation. Every step of every process, making sure there's never a point where that password is transmitted to us. And you have to really you go through all those holes, and that's why it's tough to do these things post haste. It's tough to come in afterward and go, all right, now I want to do privacy, because you don't think about all those ways in which that information is actually transmitted. Oh, is it a follow-up question?
Yeah. If the password isn't transmitted, how are you authenticating requests for data?
Through the client.
Auth token or?
Yeah, through the client. Yes. And I may almost start sending you to our website for more information, because I feel like you're butting up close to. I'm pretty sure it's an auth token, but it's all done through the client. And there is information on the site that talks more specifically about this. This was why my disclaimer was critical in the beginning. So yes.
Yeah. So to send you data to back up, I'd have to encrypt it, right? And which is some app that you supply.
Right. You don't have to encrypt it. Our application handles that. That's correct.
Right. So I install your application, which has some memory footprint and some compute load.
Which used to be terrible, by the way. It's gotten better over the years.
Yeah. I knew enough to guess that it might be terrible. So
yeah, it's got. I will say the first version. The first version. Since we're talking transparency, was god awful. I mean, it was not good. We were, when SpiderOak was fired up and it was encrypting your data and doing all these things, it took a while. This is actually, I mean, look, in all of this, when you talk about encryption, you talk about the cloud, you talk about these things, and and all these conversations are really entangled together, because you're talking about an entire industry that is moving in a direction, and a big part of that is how powerful these machines are, and we just talked about how powerful these are. So now, thankfully, the machines are, both the ways you can do encryption have improved, and also the power of the machine is improved, such that it is not as, it's really not noticeable at all on a modern machine. Now, if you're on an old machine, you'll notice it. There are certain points, if you're doing your first backup, it'll sometimes chunk along on a bigger, if we're uploading a 5 gigabyte movie, you may feel it a little bit. Our suggestion is always do the uploads at night, so you don't have to deal with the computer problems during the day, the slowness. But it's one of those things that, as an industry, it is getting better, and those things have to happen. I mean, our product would not be usable today if advancements in other technologies weren't also happening at the same time. Again, that's why web encryption is really kind of fascinating, and we're really happy to see that advance, because it allows us to do a lot of other things, and it's now at a point where it can happen without destroying the machine, the usability of the machine. And so those are definitely things that are improving our industry as a whole and allowing us to do these things without, the last thing you want to have to deal with is you're trying to send something and a product is chugging along in the background, eating up 99% of your CPU because it's encrypted. Now, I will say, a lot of things are, a lot of companies today, including us, are smart about, as you're changing things, only backing up the diffs and doing things like that, which we do, and a lot of other companies do, and it saves time and bandwidth and workability and a lot of other things. Yeah. No, I mean, there's only 5 people here, so.
Do you use SSL for the transmission, or just rely on the encryption?
SSL, it's also transferred in SSL. Everything we do. All right. Well, I wanted to end early so that we could go gamble all of our money away.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Only if you tell me how much you have to gamble.
Right. This is in my privacy place, and I can tell you it's going to be 0 by the end of the day because I'm terrible at the tables. All right. Does anybody else have any questions? Anything else? No. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. It was fun.